evening, everybody. My name is Stephanie Jaramillo, and I've been in the addiction world going on 10 years. And so I'd like to start off by giving a little bit of information about what addiction is. So let's start from the beginning. There are a number of different definitions out there, and obviously, addiction isn't a one-size-fits-all situation. And so, one of the best working definitions that I found comes from Dr. Gabor Mate, a major player in the field of addiction, that describes it as continued use of that substance or that behavior despite its negative consequences. And so that tends to be the definition that I think that works out really well. We all tend to have a little bit of a working idea of what we think addiction is. I know the movies portray it a certain way, TV portrays it another way, and the experiences of ourselves and our loved ones plays out very differently as well. And so keep that in mind when we're thinking of addiction is despite the consequences, we're continued to using. There's a difference between problematic use and addiction. Addiction is one of those aspects where try as we might, all despite the consequences, we tend to continue to use. And there's oftentimes a level of dependency and other aspects. Much like cancer or any other sort of problematic illnesses that we get in our life, addiction has stages, so oftentimes a lot of people's conception of what addiction is tends to look more like that stage 4, homelessness, loss of everything, hit rock bottom, those types of things, and doesn't really go into how there's very different aspects of addiction. So we got problematic use, which usually kind of looks much like, hey, I'm misusing it, maybe even binge drinking or whatever kind of aspects, and that leads to a consequence. Once I hit that consequence, that is enough to start changing the direction of what I'm going to do. Meaning, let's say my drug of choice happens to be alcohol, and I get a DUI, and given all the consequences of the DUI, I decide that, you know what, it's time to sober up and, shift gears and readjust some of my habits that I've gotten into. Addiction isn't quite that easy, despite the consequences, despite all these other negative implications of my substance use or behavioral pieces. There changing on my own isn't much of a possibility. So continued use despite negative consequences and failed attempts at quitting. And so if we were going to look at stage 1, addiction, we are no longer in that problematic use, we're in that addiction to where try as I might, I'm not changing. This might look very normal. And oftentimes I hear this as being described as like the functional addict or the functional alcoholic, where they're starting to see problems in their lives, whether it's cost burdens or failed relationships or frustrated people. And there isn't a ton of insight into the stage. At this stage, they may be a little bit more in denial, like, I don't have the problem, you have the problem. Um, and it looks more like that, where essentially, there's definitely some consequences, might, albeit minor, but somewhat functioning or somewhat getting through, but alarming to those that are around them. Typically, this is when like friends or family are starting to be like, well, do you think that that might be related to your drinking? Or, I'm concerned about your drinking or use or whatever. And it's met with some criticism and some, frustration of like, hey, you drink too, or whatever. Stage 2 is very much like stage 1, a little bit more rooted in some denial, but the consequences are starting to get bigger, or loved ones leave, or there's a breakup or a divorce, problems at work where now you're maybe on a probationary period that's turning into like, hey, one more wrong move and you're fired. It could look a little bit more like increasing the intensity, frequency, and duration of uses in between. So what may have been like, okay, 2 glasses of wine at night with dinner, to two turns into four, four turns into six, that sort of thing. Or weekends start a little bit earlier on Friday, where it's like 4 o'clock couldn't come quick enough, or 5 o'clock in the evening can come quick enough, and that sort of thing. So it's like upping the amount I drink, upping the amount of consequences that I'm facing, and that sort of thing. Next, we're going into stage 3 addiction, and we're really looking at major consequences. Maybe at this point, there's even been incidences with the law, and not just in a DUI sense, but maybe even some probationary periods. And now there's some insight as to like, maybe this is a little bit of a problem. And at this point in time, there's been some failed attempts at trying to quit. All of these stages have something in common, and that's where there's guilt and shame for the amount of use, things that they start when they start sobering up, really start to kind of question, and those types of things, however, can present very defensively still. And then lastly, stage 4, we're looking at dependence as well. So it's not just necessarily just like try as I might, I can't quit, but also having some pretty big implications, health pieces, not just like the failed relationships or even job losses, but even now more so like health aspects. Cirrhosis of the liver, cancers, those types of things. And so those are kind of the stages. Let's talk a little bit about how addiction, there's a ton of different ideas of what addiction is, and there's a lot of debate. And ultimately we've all been somewhat impacted by addiction, indirectly or directly. And so one of the best movies that I've ever watched that kind of breaks down addiction very beautifully, it's called Pleasure Unwoven by Dr. Kevin McCauley. Dr. Kevin McCauley is also in recovery. And so he was in treatment, and they kept calling addiction a disease, and it would frustrate him because he would be like, hey, listen, cancer befalls on the person unknowingly, unwillingly. I chose to drug or drink. This isn't a disease. And so after he left treatment, it sent him on a decade-long journey in which his whole goal was to prove that addiction is not a disease. And so in doing so, it definitely opened our eyes that there might be some components here that fit that disease model. And he makes a very compelling argument. But what he does do is he uses the landscape of Utah as a metaphor for what's going on in the brain processes. And so I think this is where it's a really good idea to understand what addiction is doing. So there's something called salience in our brain. So our brain recognizes what is important for survival. And so that salience factor is huge. So your brain knows you really well and recognizes that, hey, if it's not pleasurable, you may not engage in it. And so it ties in survival importance to pleasure. So that way you'll do it. So for instance, there's chocolate cake and broccoli. And you can tell the difference between chocolate cake and broccoli. But because you have to know the difference between chocolate cake and broccoli. If you were stranded on a deserted island, um, broccoli alone doesn't have enough nutritional value to sustain your life. However, chocolate cake can. And so therefore it has a different salient value. Therefore, there's a different pleasure value in when you eat it because it has more salient value. Salience is huge when it comes to your survival. So the answer for sleep, the answer for tiredness is sleep. The answer for hunger is eating, those types of things. And so our brain makes them pleasurable, so we do that. However, when things start breaking down, things become problematic. The thing about drugs and alcohol is because the salience factor has a lot to do with chemical receptors, dopamine and glutamate. And so I won't spoil the movie. Go out there and watch it. But what happens is alcohol and drugs and behavioral patterns like gambling, sex, pornography, video gaming, etc., releases large amounts of dopamine, more so than what your brain was really ready to have. And so eventually what happens is these things climb the salient ladder falsely, and it turns out to be the number one thing. So instead of the answer to being hungry is eating, now it's your drink or drug of choice. The answer to tiredness is no longer sleeping, it's the drug or drink of choice. And it's because of this irrational assignment of this value that your brain does, tips the scales kind of over into that direction of addiction. Then, when that happens, we engage in these behaviors compulsively, and try as we might, it's really difficult to quit because the answer to stress, hunger, tiredness, all those things now become the drug or drink of choice. And so that makes it very difficult then to recover. And so when we know some of the more biological or physiological components to addiction, we can start understanding how to treat it. Since there's a breakdown on all these different levels of brain processing, you could see why it's not so much a matter of love or a matter of willpower or a matter of, just stop, because ultimately it's starting to take the place of what is normally, the answer to, because it has this high, salience value. So over time, when we remove the drug or drink or processes that we have been conditioned to or like addicted to, then we can start finding ourselves getting back into like a normal headspace. However, addiction does create a hyper memory. So it's constantly there. That's why recovery is an ongoing event and not something that's just one and done. And so ultimately, that's kind of a little bit of a breakdown of what addiction is and how it affects the brain, and that real treatment is available to recalibrate some of these, you know, breakdowns on all brain levels.